notable feature of Cultists really comes down to the way they can get free cult steps from their inherent ability. So the way this works is if you upgrade next to one of your opponents and they accept the power, they accept that power, you get a free cult step on the cult of your choice. And this, if they decline it, which they usually shouldn't, but sometimes they will, you still get a free power. And so this is a way for you. What's nice about getting the cult step is you start, moving up. You can get those cult rewards off of the the track, and you're going to get power from moving up the cult track. So this becomes a really, really powerful. It's a way to build economy while also set yourself up for endgame scoring. So they tend to dominate the cults. That's the most important thing. It's very significant for cultists. Their stronghold is not very important. If you build it, it should only be at the end of the game. It just gives you 7 points one time. It's also particularly expensive. Also note their sanctuary is a little extra expensive. But the big thing is getting those free cult steps and what that means for how you play them. Cultists will almost always be on E6 and F5. E6 is essential. Basically, cultists really want to be in places where they're giving multiple people power round one, so that people will almost never decline your leech round one if someone else is getting it too. And so by making sure that you're adjacent to more than one other color, it's a way to really increase the chance that you're going to get those cult steps. So E6 tends almost never gets its leech declined. F5 tends to be pretty safe. F5 is nice because it has dig G5 to get to H7. It also could be getting G4 and then to the south. You could consider F5, F7. The problem with that is if you get, and let's say there's a gray player here, but no other neighbors in the east. If you get a gray player who just decides, you know what, I have all this control over cultists, I can decline the power they're giving me, and now every single step that you could get building in the east, you're not getting because just one player has decided they don't want to feed it to you. That's a lot of control to give another player over your fate. So cultists will almost always be F5, E6. I think that's definitely the way to that should be your default. So cultists, this is looking at Claybo's opening slide. So they're pretty flexible, especially if they have access to that one dig for 2 hexes in the east. So if black isn't on G5, it's really easy for them to open temple with 2 new dwellings because, they just need dig scroll or a single dig. Of course, double dig would do it too. But any of those would make it easy for them to go temple new dwellings. And usually their temple round one will be earth one or fire one. They tend to really like fire one because they're a faction that likes to go shipping. And I'll talk about that in a second. But they like to really get their shipping up quickly, which is another reason why not round one, so they don't do any shipping round one typically, but I'll show you in the rounds 2, 3, and because they crank up the cults, they tend to get tons of power. They can access a coins action. So imagine them on dig scroll. They go temple 2 new dwellings without having to use any power. They take coins. They take priest. They could easily be at 2 shipping in round 2. Now the other, so that's, I think, the most straightforward opening. And then the idea being just take your cult steps on whatever will give you cult rewards. Now, if round one's going to feed you like tons of, let's say it's coins back from Earth, you could go Earth 2 round 1. So you get the extra worker production and you're going to get, coins back from that. Likewise, Air 2 tends to be a little less common because they get so much power from going up the cults, but if it's going to get you a cult reward, that can be nice too. They tend to have strong economy, so you could go Earth 1 round 1 and just bank on all the economy from going up the cults to sort of keep you afloat. Now, Claybo here has super strong for 2 temple. The reason 2 temple is really appealing for cultists, especially if they can get workers and digs off the cults early, is that you'll get 4 steps on the cults if you think about it, because this is trading post temple, trading post temple. So that's 4 steps, as opposed to, often if you're going 2 new dwellings, that last dwelling you build isn't next to someone else, so that won't give you the steps. So 2 temple gives you 4 steps. It also now cranks up your priest production, which lets you go to 2 ship early and or really put a stranglehold on the cults for yourself. So that can be a pretty appealing opening. I think most beginners just focus on one of these 2. I think that's probably the place to start for you. So one thing I just want to emphasize is, yes, cultists tend to do well in the cults, but you don't want to overdo it either. You're going to get all kinds of steps on the cults naturally just from people accepting your leech. So you can put a priest or 2 to the cults early, but you don't need to keep feeding priests into the cults in the mid game. A lot of time, and the other reason that's important is usually that's at the cost of getting your shipping up. So let's assume you're on E6, F5. And usually you're templing on E6. You might be templing in round 1 or 2 on F5. You want to get G5 H7 if you can and do an East Town. Ideally from E6, you're getting E5 F3, or if black's in the game, if you can get F3 and then maybe round 3 or something like that, you're getting G2 and doing a sanctuary town in one of those ways. So if black happens to be on G5, what you're trying to do is make sure you get G4, bridge, H5, I8, maybe I7, and that way you can sort of connect. The other thing that you want to be doing is getting your shipping up, because there's some really nice options for expansion if you can get to 2 and 3 shipping. So if you are on E6 and you get, let's say you're on get F3, now with 2 shipping, you can reach E3. If you can dig B3, you can also get A7, B2. And now you've claimed, some pretty nice territory in the north. And if you're kind of looking like this seems like it could be another town area potentially for you, it's fine if it doesn't. It's just as useful expansion. And from B2, you have digging B1 to get to A1 as a possibility as well. So that's why, getting your economy up, getting a nice presence on the cults, but don't overthink it, right? Sometimes, racing to the 2 key town that gives you 2 steps on each cult, sometimes that's useful, but sometimes you can fight cults enough. And actually what's more important is trying to set yourself up to win network in addition to getting a good chunk of cult points. Another example of why it's nice to get your ship up as cultists is it's possible from F5, if you're on 3 ship, one idea a little bit later in the game is, can you grab B5 with a dig, and now you can reach D8, and you could actually now be building on the other side of this area. So that's an idea also for something to look out for. So cultists are a little bit ridiculous in that they can do super well on the cults and also do well on network. So don't forget that you should look for opportunities to try to win network as well. Cultists are really strong, almost annoyingly strong. They're very, very strong. So that they're a faction that in auction needs to be bid down a bit. So definitely look for them to be quite strong. They tend to be flexible because they can play tall and just focus on cults, or depending on the cult rewards, they could focus more on shipping, expansion in different ways. Some things that affect cultist strength. In general, they're just very, very strong. If they're the only cult faction, then it gets scary, right? So let's say there's no Orin, there's no Chaos Magicians, there's no Swarmlings. If that's the case and they're the only cult faction, that starts to seem like they can sleepwalk their way to a bunch of cult points. And so they could almost just focus on trying to get network points and still get a ton of cult points. Another thing to look out for is they want to be on E6 almost all the time. Can they get a sanctuary town there? if they can, that's really helpful. If they can't, that's definitely something to think about. Like if black is going to be on e5 and yellow is going to be on f3, that's a pretty big issue. If you can at least get one of those two hexes, then there's three different places with 2 digs you could get that. So if you can get that sanctuary town there, that makes a really, really big difference. And you kind of want to be able to town moderately early, so you can somewhere in the mid game, not too late, so you can start closing some cults with all your steps. So the other thing that's a bit tricky about Darklings is they, more than Alchemists, sometimes start G5. Alchemists occasionally start here, although I think it's usually a mistake. And that takes away the 1 dig for 2 hexes. You can still head down that way, but that definitely takes some of the fun out of starting in the east there. But it's usually still right to start F5, even if Darklings have started there. If Darklings place before you and start G5, you could start on the other side potentially. So let's see. We don't like seeing Darklings, but it's not a deal breaker. We don't love seeing Nomads because Nomads will be on F3, and they might also be on B4 or E8. They could be on G4, but as Cultists, we can probably beat them to E8, so that's a mistake. But if Nomads with their 3rd placement go on G4, let's make sure we beat them to E8 and punish them. If we can get E8, then we can on 3-ship connect A7 to E6. But Nomads can be tricky if they're on like D3, F3, E8. Now it's going to be, there's a little bit of a race to B4. They'll probably beat us there. And so it can be pretty hard for us to connect in that situation. So if we can't get a sanctuary town in the middle and Nomads are in and they're going to like sort of block our connection, now the game looks pretty tricky. It might still be okay if we could do 1 town in the east and then maybe a town in the south. That might still be a totally fine Cultist game, especially if we can crush the cults. Alchemists and Fakirs tend to not be too bad for Cultists, although it can make it can put a little pressure on the north for us. But it's not quite as bad for us as someone like Darklings. The last thing is there a neighbor in the east for brown? Like you want to ideally gray, maybe green. You want them in the game so that when you're building on those east hexes, you're going to get cult steps from it. So that's the other thing to look out for. If it's dwarves, they might dig north, but they also will tunnel over to H6, for example. So you like to see one of those factions in the game. Once you've gotten some experience with Cultists, you can try some different things. Like you can try for getting 50 end game points, right? Can you win all 4 cults and win network? That can be a fun thing to try to gun for. Another idea would be going digging. Increase your digging and try to dig a bunch in a round 4 dig game. That totally can work for Cultists. They tend to have a lot of priests, and maybe they're getting a lot of workers off the cults. That could be appealing. And another last idea to maybe start experimenting with is playing tall. Play with 10 or fewer structures, just 2 towns, and just try to hit, get a lot of cult points and just hit trading post scoring, error 1, score with your stronghold late. That can be another way to play Cultists.